Welcome back. Thank you for joining us again today for this. Actually, we're starting a new series last week.
Well, not really a new series.
Sorry, the fourth part of this series.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. So this is episode 2. So if you want to catch the opening part of this series, it was in our Sunday live stream, which part of it will be available on this channel later in the week. But let's just review what it is. Actually, we're talking in this part of the series about healthy correction.
Yeah.
Healthy correction is one of the 4 ingredients of having good soil in our hearts so that God's word can flourish and grow in us. We call this living a transformed life. So let's just review all the ingredients quickly. First of all, the first ingredient was joy, or more specifically, living a joy-filled life.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really important that when we talk about joy, just so that we know how we're defining it, we are talking about relational joy that comes from being with other people who are happy to be with you. And then we talked about different practices we can do to really build joy in our life so that we can be filled with that. And there is a little handbook we put together, which will be available in the show notes, so that if you want to go back to that, if you're like having some just sort of, because this is a while ago, this is September when we started the joy one. Yeah. So I can understand where it's like, hey, I maybe have fallen off on some of those practices, or I need to revisit them a little bit. Just encourage you to go back to the videos, look at that little handbook.
Sure. So the second ingredient is attachment love, which really gets its meaning for what we're talking about from the Hebrew word hesed. So this is where we form loving, joy-filled bonds with other people. So it's sort of the group where you feel where you belong.
Yeah.
For followers of Jesus, this is our church community. And depending on the size of your church, more likely the small group where you're going to have a little bit closer friendships.
Yeah, that's right.
And then we just finished up the part of the series on the next ingredient, which is group identity. So these are the characteristics and values of the group. So that's that we belong to, and what it determines how the people in our group respond to different situations. And we kind of put together a little statement to help us understand it better. So we are a people who, and we sort of fill in the blank. So as followers of Jesus, we take the cues from Jesus himself. So the longer we're in relationship with Jesus, the more we should become like him. So what are some of the things we talked about so far?
Yeah, we've talked about things like, well, we talked about just reading our Bible. Yep. Just that helps us to see who Jesus was and really take that into consideration, and that's really helpful. We also then talked about things like compassion, humility, patience, practicing generosity, solitude and prayer, kindness, and loving our enemies, which was a kind of a big one on that. Yeah. So
and all of the accounts where Jesus gives examples of those are found in what are called the Gospels, the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in your Bible. And the last ingredient now that we're exploring is called healthy correction. And Michael Hendricks, in the book The Other Half of Church, the book he co-wrote with Dr. Jim Wilder, says that even with joy, attachment, love, and a strong definition of group identity, group identity can still actually, what he calls, malfunction when we fail to act like Jesus, and that can actually become a recurring pattern. So that's where healthy correction comes in. Now, Jay, you kicked off a series this past Sunday, so why don't you just give us a few highlights of what you talked about?
Yeah, so it's really important that no matter where we are in our sort of, we'll say, our maturing, character growing place, we can get off track.
Yeah.
And it's just, we should always realize that no matter the most mature, hopefully that means we're getting off track a lot less.
Yep.
But we can still do it to where we're new and we're kind of growing. That obviously we're going to get things off track. And so when it comes to healthy correction, it's really important that we establish the other ingredients. To practice healthy correction well, those things need to be there. We need joy and hesed to be a foundation of correction.
Sure.
We need group identity to be the destination we want to lead each other back from correction. And so just kind of using the encounter of Jesus and Peter in John 21, And this is after the resurrection, and this is kind of in response. This is in response to Peter denying Jesus and denying he had anything to do with him. You have them on the beach, coming off of just some of the apostles fishing, and the image that John sets up is a reminder of Peter's denial. And so you have the image of the charcoal fire, which is the only other time you ever hear that, is at the time of that denial. You have the triple repetition of Jesus asking Peter, "Do you love me?" which it is recorded that Peter denied him 3 times. But Jesus in that moment is inviting Peter back into group identity. And it's a very specific one, because you use the word love, is attachment love, because the denial was actually an act of Peter detaching himself from Jesus. From Jesus, and so this is him bringing him back, reminding him who you are, reattaching, and then bringing him back in community when he says, feed my lambs. Says, do you love me? Yes, I love you, Jesus. He says, feed my lambs. He says, take care of my sheep. And so that bringing back into community.
So that's the identity that Jesus called Peter to in the first place. When he said, you won't no longer fish for men or for fish. You'll become a fisher for men.
That's right. So unhealthy correction puts the focus and spotlight on the wrong or bad behavior and leaves the individual in isolation. Whereas healthy correction has that person face the wrong, that's still important, but brings the focus to guiding them back into group identity and community.
And I think you kind of alluded to it at the front, but it's absolutely essential that all 4 ingredients are in place in order for transformation to happen, and they must naturally occur in the order we've described. So it starts with joy, then attachment, love, then group identity, and only then healthy correction. I think as followers of Jesus or the churches or there's jokes about Christian ladies all over the place where it's just their whole meme was toxic shame, basically.
Basically.
So healthy correction requires healthy shame. And I know when I hear the word shame, I don't normally associate it with anything that's healthy.
No.
Exactly the opposite. We've all experienced shame. And for the most part, it was hurtful and toxic and made us feel bad. So we naturally just avoid it.
That's true.
So we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive than on toxic shame, so we can contrast it to healthy shame, which we're not really going to talk about today. And we don't mean to leave people in a negative space, but these are 2 very distinct topics that require us to, I think, get a better understanding of in order to be able to contrast them.
Well, and I think to even mention the idea of healthy shame, I'm sure if you're listening to this or watching us right now, you might be like, you need to explain that.
Yeah.
Because that is the way we felt.
Yeah, exactly.
And even Michael Hendricks in the book, when Jim Wilder basically talks about this
when you first met him,
of healthy shame, pushed back quite a bit on that. So understandably, to push back. So that's why we want to separate that a little bit and talk about what that means. But we will get
there. So Jay's going to talk about that again this coming Sunday, which that message will also be available on this channel. But for now, let's focus on toxic shame. So toxic shame usually communicates the message that you are bad. So the message rarely gives any solution or any way out of your badness. No. So essentially, we're left in a state where we experience shame with no solution or help. And again, toxic shame is almost always verbal and comes in the form of condemnation. And that is processed on the left side of our brains. And if we validate the message with agreement in our thoughts, then our feelings will be magnified and we will feel much worse. So for example, to show how that works, this has actually happened to me before. If someone says that you are fat, I immediately feel bad. Because I think in our culture has arbitrarily decided that being fat is bad at this moment. And maybe not so much now as it was a few years ago, but I think it's still there. So if the voice in our head, when hearing that, says, yes, I am fat, in fact, I'm really fat, but I've tried so hard to lose weight, but I just can't, then we'll actually feel worse. Maybe even to the point of what they call in the book, shameful distress. And again, I just wanted to highlight what you said a minute ago is that, again, this is a relational issue.
Yeah.
And so when we're feeling bad, it usually leaves us in a place where we are alone.
Yes.
So there's no way out or no way back to community. Now, I have a personal example of this from my childhood, actually. When I was 8 or 10 years old, we would often on weekends eat at my grandparents' house. Now, my mom has 12 brothers and sisters. And so usually there's one or two other families there for kind of a family dinner. We couldn't all be there at once, way too many people, but we would sort of take turns. And so, I mean, I love being at my grandparents' place. They had a huge, big backyard it was kind of treed on 3 sides.
Okay.
So it seemed kind of private. There was a garage on the one side between them and the neighbors. So it was a great place to run with my cousins and play with. I have some uncles that are not much older than me. So it was just a great place to be. And in the summertime, we often ate outside at picnic tables. So one summer when I was about 8 years old, I came running up from the basement of the house to the back door, and the back door kind of intersected with the kitchen coming down a stair or two. And my grandmother was carrying out some plates of food. Now I ran out the door and I pushed the screen door as hard as I could. And it was an old door. And you know where screen doors, when they open wide, they have that little tube on them that's supposed to make it close slowly. Yeah. I guess this one, I'd pushed it so hard and it opened so far that didn't happen. And the door came slamming right back, slammed, broke the window in the screen door. And the glass kind of shattered right onto my grandmother.
Oh, okay.
Who was carrying the food, who then dropped all the plates of food.
Oh, no.
And they broke. And then, I can never even remember ever my grandmother saying a harsh word to me in my whole life. And she looked right at me. And I guess if I understand it correctly, she was probably a little bit angry in the moment and surprised.
Yep.
And so she looked at me and said, "You stupid kid." And I just stood there shocked. I mean, I was overwhelmed with shame when she said that to me. And so I ran and hid. Again, there's that isolation thing, right? Immediately I felt the shame from that moment, and I ran and just wanted to get away from it and be by myself. So after the mess was cleaned up, my mother came and found me, and I was kind of cried on her shoulder. And my grandmother was also feeling bad and remorseful, and she actually apologized to my mother in front of me. So I think it would have been better to apologize to me, but I think that was pretty typical for the time period. But she did, got to hand it to her, she did express her feelings, and she actually said that she was sorry. I'm trying to think of her exact words there. I felt so bad for Ron as soon as I said those words. So she knew that it had been shaming to me. And because she apologized and she was my grandma and I loved her, our relationship was quickly restored. And so I think that story illustrates that in moments of toxic shame, our first impulse is to isolate, and not all toxic shame comes out of manipulation, or we'll talk about that in a minute. But it was just a surprise.
Yeah, I think that's the important thing to look at when it comes to toxic shame. It doesn't necessarily, we don't want to set up the good guy versus the bad guy, Superman versus Lex Luthor, Batman versus the Joker, kind of idea. Like the truth is
I'm Batman,
because we experience.
Sorry.
Because we experienced, we'll experience toxic shame. I'm pretty sure all of us have.
Yeah.
It gets modeled for us.
Yeah.
And we then sometimes express toxic shame.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily we're thinking, oh, I'm going to express toxic shame. It comes out much like your story with your grandma. It comes out really, really fast.
Yeah.
It's kind of been modeled to us, and we don't really realize, hey, there might be a better way to do this.
Yeah.
Or sometimes it's like, oh, it's effective. And that's helpful, right? Because it's effective.
Yeah.
It's like, but it's not helpful. It's effective.
Yeah.
But it's not, no good growth is coming as a result of it.
Yeah.
Like even with your story, I felt like I've seen myself in any of those three characters, whether it's your grandma,
Yep.
I just say, yeah, sure, I've done that. Yourself, I've definitely been on the receiving of that, and I've definitely been like your mom, the comforter,
in that
has went to the person who's experienced.
Yeah, and in this particular case, I think it was very out of character for my grandmother to respond that way. I mean, I don't think she ever said a harsh word to me after that either. So anyway, I think just to reiterate some of the things about toxic shame here, toxic shame is always isolating. Toxic shame happens when we're told there's a problem, but there's no relational solution provided. So without a relational solution, we withdraw. And in cases where shame is recurring, we seek other ways to escape shame in distractions, which can become addictions. And I think that's important to note that there are cases where there are people that are narcissistic, and they will repeatedly try and use toxic shame on people they know they can take advantage of.
Yeah.
And in those cases, the people being taken advantage of want to avoid that. And so this is where a lot of times, not every time, but there are times where this can be the start of an addiction process. And that could be.
Well, because that is the natural thing when we experience toxic shame. Obviously, it's never going to feel good.
Yeah.
But what we do is become really good avoiders of it, and that doesn't solve toxic shame.
No.
It actually kind of entrenches toxic shame, and so that's where, because addictions are often somehow, if it's not avoidance, it's soothing,
Yeah.
it's self-medicating.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, it's all about really you are avoiding what's going on there. You're trying to avoid all those feelings.
And let's be clear what we're talking about here. We're talking real addictions: eating, shopping, alcohol, drugs, pornography, doom scrolling, pretty much anything that will distract or mask us from the shame and feeling of isolation. Now, the problem with a lot of addictions is it just leads to further isolation.
It really does.
Yeah. So let's take a moment. I did mention narcissism. It's important to recognize what sort of some of the tools narcissists use to manipulate people, and toxic shame is often one of them.
Really
They'll try and manipulate you or me, or do something that they want you to do, or sometimes they do it just to give them a sense of control.
Yep.
So we must learn to identify toxic shame and learn to reject it from a person who's a narcissist, even if they're in a position of authority, and often they are.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Wilder in his book suggests that a firm rejection of condemnation or toxic shame is a way of loving a narcissist, which really surprised me when I read that.
Yep.
But he goes on to explain, by doing this, we give them a window into a life free of toxic shame, which can be a first step in healing for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you had mentioned this while we were just discussing this. Up to now, we've been saying that most of the time, what we're talking about here is a toxic shame that's happened to us.
Yeah.
But I think we also need to learn to recognize toxic shame that we may have done to others.
Yeah, and the thing is, the chances, I think if we're going to be honest with ourselves, yes, it's probably happened to us, and as a result, obviously that it's been modeled, and we kind of do it. And again, that's why I like the story of your grandma. Is just like sometimes it comes out in that surprising moment, and it, like, yes, we might catch ourselves after the fact.
Yeah,
but
and you think, where did that come from?
Where did it come from? And I think we've got to be aware of that. We are looking not just about what's been done to us, but also that we might need to get healthy correction from when maybe we've used toxic shame. Because the truth is, toxic shame is just, doesn't take much to find it in this world. It's quite normal.
Yeah. So toxic shame does not in any way develop character or improvement or change. So that's the whole point of the four ingredients in the good soil, is to have life transformation or change. So toxic shame does not do that. Now, just shame, not toxic shame, but shame is hardwired into our brain. So that was something that also took me aback a little bit in the book. It's one of the 6 big emotions that are hardwired into the brains, like the other ones, like fear, disgust, anger, sadness, and despair. So shame in and of itself is not bad and is a natural response. But we must, in order to deal with shame, we must learn how to process it in a healthy way. So one, we do that by expanding our understanding of that process. And it starts with, the first step is recognizing toxic shame, which is what we've been trying to talk about today. So we will be looking at some healthy ways to process shame this coming Sunday in our in-person gathering. So,
yeah. Well, this is a heavy topic of shame, and like we said at the beginning, it might be really difficult, especially as you've heard us talk about toxic shame, and then there's healthy shame. What do you mean by that? And we will get into that. Not here, but we just encourage you to see that video when we do it. You might be, much like Ron shared, you might have a story very easily come to mind of experiencing toxic shame, and it might be something that happened in the past, and it might be really affecting you to this day. And we just encourage, if that has come to your mind, we encourage you to take the time and ask God and someone in your community to just kind of pray with you and kind of help you bring some healing to that moment, so that you can process it healthily, and allow, again, the deep pains that can happen when we experience toxic shame. And by bringing God into it and someone in your community, you start to remove that isolation aspect to it. And so we just encourage you to do that. The other thing is, you might be aware of, like, there are times I've definitely used toxic shame.
oh, yeah.
And one, you're not a bad person.
Mm-hmm.
We're all guilty of doing that, and we're on the process of growth. And the realization is such a great moment that says, there's a place I need some guidance in, and some maybe repentance and forgiveness of yourself, and maybe even need to go apologize to someone.
Yeah.
And just sort of kind of try to relearn how to not use things like toxic shame. Take that time this week. Don't beat yourself up. We want to remind you that you are a compassionate person. You are a kind person. You are a loving person. And sometimes we forget who we are. And we invite you back into community and back into that identity. Don't let yourself get caught up there. And like all of us, we're going to heal from that and get better at what healthy correction looks like, and so that we can do that well and not move into toxic shame. So thank you for joining us, and please like and subscribe, and we will see you next week.